Final Fantasy II is certainly the black sheep of the franchise, a reputation which, playing for ourselves, is unfortunately deserved. What many players will bring up during discussion is the wayward growth system, which can easily be exploited by cancelling your moves to receive level ups based on the intended action, or hitting yourself to boost your HP. However, today on the Gemini Report, we want to cover more overlooked aspects when analysing the game, such as the utilisation of the cast and the pacing of the adventure as a whole. We must warn you in advance that there'll be some story-related spoilers. If you would rather experience the game yourself before we spill the beans about later plot points and areas, then come back to this video after completion. Unlike its predecessor, Final Fantasy II puts greater emphasis towards its characters. This mentality is demonstrated through its battle system, where they're not defined for any concrete builds, but rather they arrive as blank slates whose stats are increased based on the actions they perform. This focus is also showcased at the start, where, instead of naming various job classes, you name 4 clearly defined protagonists who are thrust into a personal battle rather than a sandbox. This change in focus is great on paper as it prevents the game from acting as a retread of its predecessor, and a lot of its highlights come from how the cast is utilised, though the execution is hardly consistent thanks to the game's short development time of less than a year. Despite its greater emphasis on narrative, the 3 main protagonists barely go above mute as most of their dialogue exists to advance the plot forward, as opposed to providing some insight on their personality and motivations. This causes sections where they should be pivotal to feel underwhelming, such as the siege to reclaim their hometown later on. One might argue that the developers were still aiming for a roleplay angle with them, where you have to imagine their personalities, but various sections try to give them some depth, such as Furion's weakness to woman, and Maria's goal to save her brother. Guy's quirk is perhaps the most fascinating, as he has the ability to speak to animals, which is actually worked into the gameplay in one instance, as you can use his gift to learn about a hidden passage. These traits feel like missed opportunities, causing you to wonder what the developers' true intent was with these protagonists. Leon receives more focus, though the execution is still flawed. His disappearance is a nice hook as it adds some personal motivation for the cast, though the player isn't fully incentivized to go after him as they have no insight on his personality beforehand. In some instances, you'll run into him in the guise of a Dark Knight working for the Empire, where moments of foreshadowing on his true identity are given. While these are a great idea as they prevent the final twist from coming out of nowhere, they're sadly not as common as you'd think, causing him to lack screen presence as a villain, which leads to the eventual reveal lacking the punch it should have. Furthermore, the short time on screen causes you to lack insight on why Leon chose to side with the Empire. Perhaps you're meant to roleplay this aspect? But again, what the developers were aiming for with these protagonists was unclear. Ironically, despite the developers intending the opposite, it's the temporary characters with somewhat orthodox builds who fare better in the writing front. For instance, Minwoo has a much larger spell pool than the main party, indicating his experience. Gordon's pitiful stats are fitting for one who is described to be a coward, yet they increase as he fights alongside the group, which occurs parallel to his gradual confidence building. Leela is equipped with thunder, which is ingenious considering how her occupation as a pirate would involve her having to deal with fish that attack her ship. Thus, she has a spell that they're weak to. It's these examples that prove there's still storytelling potential with traditional builds, as you can explain the characters' background and personality through stats and their initial move pools. Another tactic used to write the temporary characters was, despite them leaving your party, they come with or leave a memento with some long-term benefits. Minwoo, Joseph and Leela all come with means of transportation which stay in your inventory when they either leave or die. It's annoying how Joseph's sled is only useful for one section and has to stay in your inventory anyway, but Minwoo's canoe and Leela's ship are godsends throughout the adventure. It's not just transport either. Visiting Ricard's adoptive family after his sacrifice allows you to receive the legendary Excalibur, rewarding you for keeping him in your mind. Not only are these mementos useful, they allow the temporary characters to feel like a part of the team even when they leave. However, similar to the main cast, the execution leaves to be desired. The deaths of some of them in particular could have been handled better. Minwoo, Joseph and Ricard's deaths are well teased using their stats and equipment drawers, which indicate that they're too good to be true. As for the scenes themselves, no, all 3 characters don't have the screen time they should have to warrant the desired audience reaction. Ricard in particular suffers as he appears far too late into the game to form an attachment to him. As a result of this, it causes the scene at the end depicting Furion watching the ghosts of the fallen party members to lack the payoff it should have. As far as the villains go, I dare say the Empire as a whole was executed better than its elites. Final Fantasy II does a fantastic job at showing their strength through the gameplay, the unwinnable battle at the start in particular being a great example of this. The game also manages to keep their strength consistent, as picking fights with them in Finn and the Dreadnought will end with them wiping out your party. Even towards the end when your party is likely to be overpowered, the encounters in the world map at the start are replaced with highly ranked soldiers, reinforcing the idea of the group being at their lowest point at that stage of the narrative. Each of these encounters demonstrates how gameplay can be used to effectively showcase a villain's strength, as opposed to simply telling you by means of NPC dialogue. Unfortunately, the execution of the elites is a lot more mixed. The Lamia Queen was executed well, as her fight is foreshadowed through the princess's odd behaviour once you rescue her from the Dreadnought. However, Count Borgen was less successful. This is because the character suffers from his actions mostly being told to the player by the slaves rather than demonstrated through the gameplay. This is made up for somewhat by the fight against him at the Snow Cave, as he puts up no challenge whatsoever, proving that he is all bark and no bite. Why this fight is reused in the final dungeon when the character is resurrected is unclear, as there is no attempt to flesh him out further. It feels like they only brought him back as they ran out of sprites to use, which is a shame as the concept of a Napoleon-esque villain could have worked with better execution as promised by your first fight with him. The main antagonist, the Emperor, is definitely where the execution of the villains falls flat. It seems as though the developers had big plans for him, as indicated by his line regarding his recognition of the party from the Finn attack at the start during your first meeting with him. He even sends hordes of the riders you fought at the start of the game before your first fight against him, perhaps to taunt you. It's a shame Moore isn't done with this implied connection, as he is otherwise a generic overlord who exists to provide a final test. They don't even try to make him intimidating through the gameplay like they do with his army, as you're provided with the means to defeat him easily using the gimmicky blood sword and his weakness to the toad status. While the Empire is consistently threatening, the leader who they're building up to is a misstep thanks to the writers running out of time to follow up on the promises they implied, causing the villains as a whole to feel like a waste. The last aspect of the cast, the townsfolk, are another aspect I'm conflicted on. Unlike the temporary characters though, the topic of death's handled rather well. There are several instances throughout the narrative where towns are annihilated by the Empire. This happens extremely early on when the party fails to stop the Dreadnought from completing construction, leading to the deaths of several NPCs in Palom and Poft. While they're obvious bit players, the sheer scope in the amount that's killed causes you to feel worse about your failure and further respect the strength of the Empire. Where the execution of the NPCs begins to falter though is the ask-listen system. On paper, this is a fantastic idea as it not only provides hints on how to progress, but also allows you to learn more details regarding the game world. For example, asking Hilda a query on airships allows you to learn about the owner of one of them, Sid, and his current location. Thus, the player has been rewarded for their curiosity by learning a new aspect regarding the scenario. It's aspects like these that allow the game to succeed in the developers' intention of putting the plot at the forefront. However, after a while you begin to notice the problems that the system produces. In order to find out where to progress next in the story, you may have to reel through your ever-growing list of queries to several NPCs in a location. Doing this in a larger area such as Altea can quickly become tedious, especially to those who would rather get on with combat or dungeon crawling. Not only that, but the responses you receive from important characters later on turn from interesting tidbits to info dumps. Clearly the developers were running out of time and cartridge space to spread this information gradually, causing what seems like an interesting system at first to become a chore. If this along with other aspects regarding the cast were given tighter polish, then Final Fantasy II might be remembered more for its ambitious plot than its flawed growth system. Although 2's added emphasis on story requires a stronger cast of characters compared to the first game, it also means that the pacing must be looked at under a more critical lens as well. After all, any dull moments could risk a loss of interest from the player. Unfortunately, because this was the team's first stab at writing a serious plot for the series, it meant that there were several issues in the pacing department. I'm sorry, I didn't go into the note-taking process for this video to make me come off as a negative Nancy. On the contrary, I wanted to find something to like that many others have overlooked in their criticisms. A common pattern I've noticed with the pacing issues is that they're often accompanied with a good idea which fits with the narrative or themes. Something that can probably come back to how the exploration and battle systems were built around the scenario. The addition of learning and asking specific code words is the prime example of what I'm trying to get at here. Having to use specific phrases to get anything meaningful out of the game's NPCs does a great job at emphasising through both the gameplay and story that the Rebels' mission is to be a discreet one. However, you'll often have to refer back to your dispatcher, Princess Hilda, to learn new words in order to progress. This means that you have to go to and from Altair or Fim regardless of the distance between the areas. The pace of the narrative is hampered quite harshly by this reliance on backtracking, as the Empire will usually do something to up the stakes for players, so the last thing they would want is to miss out on the action for yet another pep talk with the princess. This is likely where Cid's airship taxi services are meant to feature. Unfortunately, the prices are way too steep to make this a consistent short-term option, especially if the player wants to devote their budget to weapons, armour and spells. Whichever way they approach things, they'll have to devote their playtime to performing what many will call busy work. I think that the developers had good intentions here. They probably wanted to discourage you from avoiding ground travel entirely, and make the increased convenience more earned. The problem here, however, is that the execution is extreme to the point of making most players want to avoid Cid full stop. This is unfortunate considering how they give the character a tragic death in the later parts of the story. I don't even believe that the backtracking would have been as big of a black mark with some careful planning. If the developers knew that the amount of Altair visits would be frequent, then they should have designed the map with that town in mind. Say, for instance, that they placed it in the centre of the world, then it would never reach an extent where the destination would be at the exact opposite of where the player currently is. Before one finds a loophole in my statement and claims that you can just scroll to the other side, you'll next have to pray that your desired island has the port to dock the ship. Instead of thinking that you've taken a clever shortcut, you'll end up resorting to somewhere that has no connection to the destination if you understandably don't want to take the long way round. This may not be the most efficient way of describing my problems, but it's the main way of doing so without resorting to a ton of thingies, or relying solely on a diagram. My point still stands though. Putting the most visited area on the bottom left of the game world may have been a decision that seemed smart at the beginning, but abides to the law of diminishing returns by the parts when you need to go to Busk. My guess is that the map was drawn as they went along, and no time was allocated to polishing it. I haven't even scratched the surface with how ridiculous these pacing issues can become. If players aren't discussing their disliking for the trips to and from Altair, then odds are they're ranting about how long the dungeons are. I can happily claim that I didn't feel frustrated during my recordings of one, but this game's stretched room lengths, as well as the high random encounter rate, were enough to set my teeth on edge. The worst part might be the doorways that lead to empty rooms which are scattered across the floor. If you make the mistake of entering one of these, then you'll be thrust into the centre, and an inevitable fight awaits you during an escape. I wish I could make an excuse for these, but I'm sorry, these add nothing but increased playtime. The enemy ambushes won't even do anything to challenge you, since they're usually the same mobs that you would have been used to beating by then. Things honestly get to a point where the adventure inside the Leviathan's stomach's a big highlight. To start, the Beast and Mysidia aren't too far apart, meaning that you won't have to worry about a long journey that will have at least 15 enemy encounters. Although the best part is its short length compared to the other dungeons. There's even a floor which doesn't have any opponents to challenge. It almost feels like a town or someone's house, which is a very refreshing change of pace from the mentally draining treks which the first two areas in the Mysidia Tower arc made you go through. While this has nothing to do with the game's pacing, the visuals inside the Leviathan are very creative. There are even parts where assets which harm the party akin to the fire in Mount Golg need to be traversed. It's clear that the map designer's imagination was at a peak for this area. Some deserve their lengths more than others. For example, the climactic places like the Warship and Mysidia Tower are appropriate as they're meant to close up specific arcs. In the latter's case, however, it's built up to with two areas that are needlessly long, namely the Black Mask Cave and the Mysidia Cave. This wouldn't have been as big of a deal if they weren't building up to the rain that you perform on Mysidia Tower. Because they do know, you're fatigued by the time you need to round out that one arc. If the choice of music is anything to go by, the developers probably wanted to evoke a feeling as though you were taking on the big cheese. It's even when they pull off the foo happy ending. Had they cut the fat from the two build-up dungeons, then the tower would have felt more exciting, and the twist might have actually shocked players rather than garner heavy groans from them. Ugh! It's not all bad, no. There's a particular section of the game that's well paced enough to keep the player's attention. More specifically, the raid on the Empire's airship after getting the Sunflame from the Cassian Keep to destroy it. Not only does it make sense to do them back to back in terms of story context, but they went the extra mile and gave you a short Star Wars-esque cutscene where the princess's ship is abducted by the Empire. Doing this without any padding in between dungeons is the best way of keeping the audience engaged with the high stakes at this point, as they wouldn't have nor want anything else on their minds other than an urgent rescue mission. It also helps how the keep is comfortably close to the warship. Unfortunately, no, the game lets itself down after that ripping section with a fetch quest based around the dragon's pendant. Not only is Diced too far away from Altair for the newly acquired boat to have a fair first run, but it feels like a major step back from the adrenaline rush which the player was treated with last time. I'm not trying to dismiss the idea of breathers after an action-packed beat in the story. In fact, they're very important so as not to completely overwhelm the audience, but enforcing a fetch quest which doesn't try to flesh out some of the new faces is an ill-advised way of approaching it. The only other time we see this back-to-back approach is when you need to go to Jade to reach Pandemonium. Unlike the warship arc, I'd say the decision to do this here is rather questionable. On one hand, you have no option to save between dungeons, meaning that you'll have to do the trip all over again should something go horribly wrong at Pandy. Look, it's the end of the script and Pandemonium is a mouthful to say. I think I've earned the right to use this cheesy abbreviation. However, the argument could also be made that it's meant to be an allegory for hell, hence why Satan and Beelzebub are amongst your opponents, meaning that it makes a degree of sense for the experience to feel arduous compared to what you'd be used to. In summary, Final Fantasy II teaches upcoming JRPG developers quite a few pitfalls they should avoid in terms of design. A change in direction, in this case a more plot-heavy one, is a bold choice considering how its predecessor's narrative was up to the player's imagination. Knownness was lost as storage limitations and tight deadlines meant that the characters who the audience are meant to connect to the story with failed to deliver on what was intended for them. Don't get us wrong, it definitely has its moments when the stakes are at their highest. However, many will become disinterested in what's trying to be offered because of the amount of backtracking between areas, as well as the long dungeons that house often questionable methods of extending their lengths. It's highly understandable why this game wasn't able to share the fan reputation which its predecessor had, even if you don't consider the time it took to reach the West. The execution just can't meet the potential which the ideas had. Tune in next week where we'll be going back to the job system with Final Fantasy III. Please let us know what your opinions are on both Final Fantasy II and this video. If the latter was to your liking, then give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it to your friends. Thank you for watching.